Hello, and thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Crystal Leach, and I'm one of the program directors for the National Science Foundation IUCRC, or Industry University Cooperative Research Center program. We're thrilled to have you join us for today's webinar. We're going to spend some time talking about the overall framework of the program. And we're also going to talk about some more specifics for those who are interested in applying and walk through some of the mechanics and logistics of that. I have a few housekeeping items. First of all, you are joining us on mute, and that's because we have quite a few folks in the audience today, and we want to make sure that everybody has a chance to hear all of the information. Additionally, the session is being recorded, so please know that, that today's session is being recorded. We will have time for Q&A at the end, and at the end of the session, the chat function will be enabled, and you'll be able to submit your Q&A through the chat function. And I'm here actually with several of my other program director colleagues, and they'll be helping us field those questions and make sure that your questions do get answered. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. And thank you again for all of you who are joining. My name is Crystal Leach, and I'm one of the program directors for the IUCRC program. So the IUCRC program is actually managed by a very interdisciplinary group of program directors. There are 7 of us across the National Science Foundation who are engaged with the IUCRC program. And many of my colleagues are joining me here today, and they will also be supporting and chatting during the Q&A session. The reason that we have such a broad cross-disciplinary team is because the IUCRC program, by definition, is not one technology area, but it can be many technology areas and also interdisciplinary by nature. So you'll be hearing from me during the first part of the slides part of today's session, but some of my colleagues will also be helping support the Q&A. So just in today's discussion, we're going to highlight some of the key points about the program and hopefully answer some of the questions that you might have. In addition to what we talk about today, there are several resources for you if you're interested in learning about the IUCRC program. First and foremost, and I can't say this enough, read the solicitation. The solicitation is literally chock full of great information about the program. It's really the guiding document that you need to understand and the framework you need to understand if you want to apply to the program. So the IUCRC current solicitation is NSF 2570, and you can find it on the link here, and you can find it on the IUCRC website as well as the NSF website. The other resource we have that's really helpful, we've recently designed our IUCRC website. Pretty simple, iucrc.nsf.gov. And so at that website, you'll find a lot of information about the IUCRC program. You'll find listing of all the current IUCRC centers with information about each of them, information about the solicitation, and the really important resource that's on the website is our FAQs. And so the FAQs probably hit many of the questions that you might have, and if we don't get to some of your questions today, I guarantee you'll find the answer to them in the FAQs. Also, feel free to reach out to the program directors. As I said, we have a cross-NSF group of program directors. All of us can be reached at iucrc@nsf.gov. So there are 2 important dates coming up within our solicitation. The first is September 8th, preliminary proposal, and that's our preliminary proposal. I'll shorten that for this presentation and use the term pre-proposal. Don't get tongue-tied. But preliminary proposal due date is September 8th. So in today's session, I'm going to focus most from a mechanics and logistics perspective for those of you who are interested in submitting to the pre-proposal September 8th due date. The same framework and overall program information applies to the full proposal due date, which is in December, but we'll likely also have an additional webinar later in the fall that talks about some of the mechanics and logistics for the full proposal due date. So let's talk a little bit about the IUCRC program at the highest level, and then I'm going to talk some of the specifics of application, specifically for if you're interested for the pre-proposal. So the IUCRC program is really unique. It's unique in that it relies through collaborative partnership to be successful. In an IUCRC, university and industry researchers come together to drive breakthrough pre-competitive research. I'm going to come back to that term, pre-competitive basic research, because it's really important if you're considering applying for an IUCRC. The program is catalyzed by NSF funding and support, and because of that funding and support, it enables close and sustained engagement, industry innovators, world-class academic teams, and government agencies. There are a couple of key points to understand about the program as you're considering applying. First is the fact, back to this pre-competitive basic research. IUCRCs focus on pre-competitive basic research. This is not a program that's directed at specific technology development or direct commercialization of academic research. Because the center is supported by a group of industry members, the Industry Advisory Board, this group requires that it be focused on pre-competitive research that's really going to address and benefit a broad number of companies within a sector. So really we're looking at pre-competitive basic research that can support needs of multiple industry members within a sector. The IUCRC program really focuses on bridging that gap between the early stage research that's happening in the academic labs and commercial deployment. So helping get through and go further in the level of technology readiness. I want to talk just a minute about more details of how the program works. So let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into that. Fundamentally, a center is a group of academic researchers who are advancing a portfolio of research projects aligned with their expertise and address specific industry-driven needs. So the IAB is the Industry Advisory Board. And this Industry Advisory Board is made up of industry and government members. Government members such as DoD, Air Force, national labs, so it can be both industry and government members. I may default and use the term industry throughout this presentation, but please know that both industry and government are able to join an IAB. So the IAB is made up of industry and government members who pay a membership fee, and they are really responsible for driving the research portfolio of the center. They all come together because they have a common need that aligns with the research expertise of the center academic researchers. So they come together to identify and direct the research portfolio and to pay for that research, right? Each IAB member pays a membership fee, and the amount of that membership fee is decided by the academic center leadership team. That money is essentially pooled to fund a portfolio of research projects that address needs that span multiple IAB members. So in a single company, paying one researcher for a single project, by joining the IUCRC, a company can advance a much larger pool of money that funds multiple projects, a portfolio of projects that can advance their business needs. Another key aspect of the IUCRC model that is unique and so valuable to both industry and academia is the leverage of funds that the IUCRC model provides. So yes, the IAB members do pay for the research, but because the NSF grant is paying the administrative and managed cost for the center, and because the university is providing the infrastructure, the intellectual capital, and the reduction in indirect costs, all of this comes together and provides significant leverage for the members on their investment. So the IUCRC really provides a framework where NSF, the university, and the IAB all provide the needed support to enable this really high-level collaborative research portfolio that ultimately provides value to the industry and to the technology development area as a whole. So I think many of you on today's call are potential academic submitters, you're academic researchers, and as such, I think you're pretty familiar with the potential value that a center that getting centers such as an IUCRC funded can have for your research program in your institution. Obviously, there's the funding aspect, not just the center funding, but also other supplemental funding that getting an IUCRC can give you access to. So there's the funding. There's also being in close connectivity to members, the ultimate user of some of the research you're doing. And there's the talent opportunities for your student. So there's obviously a benefit to you as academic researchers. We want to sit though and also talk about the benefit and the value proposition to potential IAB members. And the reason we want to do this is so as you, as potential submitters to the IUCRC program, are out talking to potential members for your center, it's really important that you can talk about the value proposition that your specific center may have, but also the value proposition that the overall program can have. And that becomes really important. So as you talk to those potential members, which is very for you to do well before you apply to the program. It's really important to understand what's in it for them and how do you speak to that in their language. So, of course, there's the research value. And certainly that is important, not just the research itself, but also access to the resulting intellectual property that comes out of the research. By joining an IUCRC, IAB members gain royalty-free exclusive licenses on the IP that's produced in a center. It's not just the research itself. By far, when we talk to IAB members, they will say one of the primary drivers for them is access to talent. The ability for industry to interact directly with your undergraduates and graduate students is incredibly valued for them. And they see access to talent as a key driver and an important part of the value proposition for joining an IUCRC. The other element is really this, what we'll call sort of this access to the network, right? IAB members really tell us that they find value in coming around the table, coming to the table and being connected to other industry and government agencies that have similar interests as themselves. Because they're in this pre-competitive phase, they're able to engage with these other IAB members really meaningfully. This access to this network is consistently brought up by IAB members as something they find valuable as being a member of a center. And finally, one of the most important things is the leverage of their dollars. So talked about this just a minute ago, right? Members put in a membership fee, but because of the IUCRC framework, where the administrative costs are funded by the NSF grant, where there is a limit on the overhead that is placed on individual research project center, and because of the amount of support that your academic institution provides, infrastructure and other areas, really these companies are getting a huge leverage on their dollar, and they're getting much more than they would be able to fund for that equivalent amount if they were just funding an individual researcher for an individual project. So the leverage is a key aspect of the value proposition. So as you're thinking about a center, as you're thinking about talking to industry members who would be interested in joining your center, make sure that you're really hitting all the points of the value proposition that could be important to them. So as I mentioned, we have a broad cross-disciplinary team at NSF that supports the IUCRC, engineering, chemistry, geo. We've got a huge amount of centers in the SCIES directorate, and also we've got a center in the SBE directorate. And the reason it's so important for us to have this cross-disciplinary, non-technology specific approach is because that's what we hear industry say is important, right? We think it's very important. We encourage submissions from a broad array of technical thrusts, and especially encourage cross-cutting interdisciplinary submissions. So what you see is just a sampling of the research thrust areas that we have funded current centers to support. If you want to see all the centers, the specifics of the research areas, please do check out our website, iucrc.nsf.gov, and you'll be able to see all of the centers, what their research thrusts are, and what areas that they're focusing on. We are wide open to transformative new center ideas. As a matter of fact, we encourage that. We encourage you to submit on new cutting edge areas of research. We do not, however, fund centers in a research area where we already have, or an existing center already is stood up. So please make sure that you're thinking about that as you're doing your submissions. Make sure you understand what the current framework is of IUCRCs as well as other centers out there in the technology area, and that you're putting forth a submission that really focuses in a new area. So I encourage you also, if you happen to see that there is a center that exists in an area similar to yours, reach out to that center leadership and talk to them about potential collaboration. There's also an opportunity to be a site addition. Make sure you've done your homework on knowing what the current landscape is of existing centers before you put your submission in place. I'm going to talk just a minute about what the framework is for the IUCRC and sort of a team dynamic, right? So the IUCRC, the most recent 2570 submission, focuses on sort of a centralized model for a center. So typically a center is made up of multiple academic sites at different universities. And we do have single centers, but those are less common for sure than multi-site centers because we're really looking at kind of gathering expertise from multiple universities, but there are multiple sites that come together to collaborate on a center. And the leadership from each of those sites is the academic leadership team. In the IUCRC model, one site is the lead site. That doesn't mean, and the other sites are partner sites. And that doesn't mean it's more important and that its research is more important, but from an operational perspective, it acts to operationally manage many of the aspects of the center. And we find that this really actually is easier and simpler for our sites and for IAB members. And it also makes sure that it's functioning as one, the center is functioning as a cohesive, collaborative unit and not individual sites sort of acting on their own and coming together just once or twice a year for an IAB meeting. So the academic leadership team, which represents the leadership of each of the sites, is regular, I don't want to say constant, but regular communication with the leadership of the Industry Advisory Board. And that academic leadership team and the leadership of the Industry Advisory Board really guide and direct the research portfolio of the center. In addition, there's a possibility to have external collaborators. And of course, within your academic institution, it's really important that you are strongly connected to your sponsored research office, typically your office, perhaps your dean, office or vice president of research. And we do require an academic policy committee. It really just helps oversee many of the activities of the IUCRC. So what are those specific roles? If you're thinking of applying, right, there's a center director, and that center director is the PI of the lead site proposal. They oversee the center operations and management and really have an oversight role for many of the operational aspects, in addition to managing the research portfolio of their institution. Each site has a PI on the proposal they submit, and that is the site director, and they manage this research program at their site. Typically, that center director and site director are making sure that the overall research portfolio is moving in a way that supports the mission and vision of the center and the needs of the IAB. A really important role, and candidly, one that often gets overlooked, is this role of an industry liaison officer. In the most recent 2570 submission, we've really highlighted this as an opportunity and even set up a budget model that allows funding within the lead site, an uneven budget model that allows funding in the lead site to support putting an industry liaison officer in place. And what does that person do? What's the role of an IAB industry liaison officer? They really are responsible for helping center leadership, identifying and recruiting new members, and for building and maintaining existing industry relationships. Quite frankly, it takes a lot of effort and a lot of time to make sure to maintain these relationships. And having somebody who's dedicated to that and not having it sort of as something that the center and site PIs also have to do is really powerful, allows a sustained partnership with the industry members. This is not a requirement, but it really is recommended. And I think if you talk to some of our centers who've been in existence and who've been successful, they really mention the importance of this role, helping them to build a strong IAB and maintain relationships with that IAB in a way that is long-term and mutually beneficial parties. A piece of advice from the IUCRC program directors, it's really important to think about your IUC leadership team. Pick your friends wisely, right? It's really critical to the center's success that you've thought about and the researchers who are coming together to form your center. This is like forming a team or a startup team. And it's really important that it's a cohesive team that's willing to work, willing to collaborate. It's pretty entrepreneurial. The work in setting up an IUCRC is very similar at times to doing a startup. So they have to be willing to put the work in and to be part of that team. And it's especially important that they have aligned goals. Where we see centers do really well, they have a strong, cohesive leadership team that's come together around a common mission and vision to advance their center. And they understand the framework, the IUCRC framework, and support that. Where we see centers that are struggling, one of the reasons is that's really not able to pull this cohesive leadership team together. So what's the path to starting an IUCRC? The first step, is being interested, which we appreciate you all being here today and participating in the webinar, and we appreciate your interest in the IUCRC program. But if you have an idea, if you have a research area, and in matter of fact, especially if you have a research group where you've collaborated other collaborators and you think this research area fits the IUCRC model, the next step is a planning grant, right, and a planning grant proposal. So that's what we're talking about here. Actually, there's actually the preliminary proposal we're talking about is actually the precursor to the planning grant. So this planning grant really gives you the opportunity to spend some time refining your center idea. So instead of immediately stepping in to forming a center, which really has quite a bit of requirements around industry advisory board members and membership, this planning grant gives you the time and the support to understand if the idea that you have for a center is really valuable and if you have the right team in place to make that happen. So you submit a pre-proposal, then you submit a planning grant. That goes under the NSF merit review process, the planning grant proposal, for 3 to 6 months. Then the next phase during that planning grant, you have 12 months to accomplish your planning grant activities. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail about what those are in a second. And then after that, the outcome of your planning grant, one of the key outcomes is to have a robust phase 1 proposal for a full proposal, center proposal. And then that center proposal comes in and goes through the merit review process before formation of an IUCRC. There is the opportunity to bypass the planning grant phase. I say this, quite frankly, with a little hesitation because there's so much value to be gained during that planning grant phase. There's a threshold for submitters who put forth a request for a waiver to fast track and bypass the planning grant process. You have to demonstrate to the program that you've really accomplished the goals of that planning grant phase separately or already. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well because there's a pre-proposal required to get both grant as well as a planning grant waiver. So what are our expectations and what are the program expectations for a planning grant? Planning grants are 1 year in duration. Each site gets $20,000. Once a planning grant is received, the grantees first and foremost are required to attend an NSF planning boot camp. And that really gives you the tools to do the customer discovery work that's so very, very important in setting up your center. The funding, the $20,000 funding per site, supports the activities for the various PIs to really go about understanding if this idea they have for a center has merit, both intellectual merit from the NSF perspective, as well as merit their potential IAB members. Additionally, these funds can be used for marketing your potential center, for customer discovery. We talk a lot about customer discovery, right? That means talking to the people who are the ultimate users of your product, right? And in this situation, your product, the center. So this planning supports your site team, PI, other faculty who might be involved, potential industry liaison officer, them spending a lot of time talking to potential IAB members so you can make sure and refine your initial center concept. And finally, that funding is used for the culmination really of your planning grant, which is a planning workshop. And in that planning workshop, the sites come together. There's one planning workshop per center and hold a planning workshop that is sort of the culmination of this customer discovery. And the outcome from a planning workshop really is threefold, right? First is to make sure that there's strong convergence between the academic researchers and potential industry advisory board members on a research agenda. And that this research agenda really is cutting edge and high impact and will advance both the academic research and the industry sector. The second outcome is really to demonstrate that there's strong industry interest to financially support your phase 1 center. For a planning grant, you're required to have letters of support. Companies need to say they're interested in attending your planning grant meeting. For a phase 1 proposal, you have to have letters of commitment. And that means that companies have to say, I am willing to join your center and pay money to do that. So the outcome of that planning grant, that planning workshop, is really to demonstrate that you have companies who are interested to financially join your proposed center. And the outcome is, third outcome is really that you've taken the input from before your planning grant proposal, you've put it together with all you've learned during this planning grant phase, and you now have a competitive proposal to submit to NSF for creation of a phase 1 IUCRC center. So maybe some key considerations for those of you who are interested in submitting a preliminary proposal. Like I said, we're going to talk for a minute now much more on the specifics of the preliminary proposal, because that is the due date coming up, the September due date, September 8th due date that's coming up. So preliminary proposals are required as a precursor to submitting a planning grant. So if you want to submit a planning grant to the full proposal December submission, you need to submit a pre-proposal to the September submission. They're also required to submit if you want to request a planning grant waiver. So if you want to submit a planning grant or you want to submit a waiver for a planning grant, those are required for the September 8th. That's what's required for September 8th. We are not accepting full proposals, or we are not looking for full proposals until September 8th. The full proposal submission date is December. So PIs of preliminary proposal will receive an encourage or discourage decision from the NSF. An encourage finding indicates that your proposal appears responsive to the 2570 solicitation and is a candidate for a full proposal for merit review. A discourage finding indicates that the project did not respond to the solicitation and has a low likelihood of funding support. This encourage, discourage decision made on the preliminary proposal of a planning grant or a planning grant waiver is advisory only. This means that PIs have both favorably and unfavorably reviewed preliminary proposals eligible to submit full proposals. So there's a lot of words on this slide, and I don't want to go over all those because you all can see those all in solicitation. But I do want to hit just a couple key points. First of all, there's a lot of words here. Submitting a preliminary proposal is really quite simple, and we intended it to be quite simple. As you can see, the requirement is the important administrative info, name, how much we're requesting, a 2-page bio of key total biographical information of the research team for the entire center. So this is not a 2-page for each person. In 2 pages, just a short bio of the important key personnel for the center, and then a 2-page description of your proposed center. And even though it's short, this is really the meat of the preliminary proposal. This is where to spend your time, right? This needs to be a crisp, clear, concise description of your proposed center. What's its mission? What's its vision? What are the unmet industry needs? Why is it important to have a center in this area? What's the economic importance? What's the research importance? What's the technological impact and intellectual merit? Why is it important that we have a center? And why is a center important as opposed to just individual researchers doing this work on their own? I mentioned before that we don't fund centers in an area where we already have an existing center. So you need to be able to talk about your uniqueness and how it's different from other IUCRCs and NSF-funded centers. We expect to see pre-existing research partnerships between all the sites related in a center. So once this collaborative research team qualified to form a center. We want to see a crisp articulation of the research thrust areas. What's the research going to be? How are those researchers going to collaborate? And what's going to be the importance of that research? And then finally, a list of prospective members and who has already been contacted and how interested are they. And each site should really talk about their individual capabilities, resources, et cetera. If you are submitting a planning grant waiver, we do require that you submit 3 pages that talks about the work you've already done that accomplishes the goals of what would typically happen during a planning grant. So What does that look like timeline? As I said, we have a preliminary proposal submission date on September 8th. We work to review those preliminary proposals quite quickly, 4 to 6 weeks. And in October, a submitter would receive an encourage or discourage notification. And we do that so that those submitters are ready and if they choose to submit to the full proposal submission date, which is December 8th. Applicants receive an encourage and discourage notification, which is advisory. These are the dates for 2021. Going forward in 2022 and beyond, the preliminary proposal submission dates are the second Wednesday in September and March, and the full proposal submission dates are the second Wednesday in, that's the wrong date on there, in December and June, not September and March. So I've spent quite a bit of time talking about the preliminary proposal, talking about the mechanics of that. As we get to the end of our prepared talk, I just want to ladder up a second and just back to the IUCRC program as a whole. What are the keys to building and launching a successful IUCRC? We talked about that model. We talked about that collaborative model where industry and academia come together, supported by the NSF. So to build and launch a successful IUCRC, we talked about the importance of your team. It really takes an entrepreneurial and collaborative mindset. This is almost like a little startup you're standing up, right? So you really need to be able to work together with the leaders of the other sites, the researchers of the other sites, and you really have to be willing to put the work in to stand up the team. Again, a strong leadership team. You will, if funded, you will be working at a minimum with this group for 5 years and could be longer. So make sure you're using those folks wisely. It's never too early to develop the institutional support you need. It will require your administration supporting your center. So get them engaged early, really reach out to them early. It's beneficial for a university to have an IUCRC. And so they're going to be interested in making sure that you're successful. So talk to them early, make sure you have their support. Again, can't say enough about the importance of customer discovery. Most startups fail because they build a product that somebody doesn't want. And it's pretty similar in the IUCRC model, right? It's if you're building a center, proposing a center that really doesn't have a customer need, you will not be successful because you will not be able to get the IAB members to join. So talk to potential center members. Also talk to faculty, talk to your administration, find out what the unmet needs are. It's really important early on, and we really expect that planning phase is really a time for you to continue that customer discovery and refine your vision of your center. And we also really recommend that you think about bringing on a team member with strong and deep industrial experience. That industry liaison officer can play a really critical role that really supports and enhances the role of the academic leadership. It allows the academic leadership team to really focus on that research, and it doesn't take away any of the relationship aspects, but it does support their work in forming the center. So reach out, network with other center leaders, network with other members of IUCRCs, and really spend time thinking about who would be potential industry advisory board members for you. So we're going to go ahead and move to the Q&A in just a minute. And we're going to go ahead and open up the chat function. And if you have questions, please place them in the chat. And my colleagues, some of my NSF other program directors, Dr. Behrouz Shirazi and Dr. Prakash, will help field those questions and make sure we get them all answered. To get us started, we have a few questions that we often get. And so we're going to ask a couple of those questions, and then we'll look at the chat to respond to your questions. So Prakash, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Prakash Balan. He's within the Engineering Directorate, one of the program officers for the IUCRC program. So Prakash, can you talk a little bit about who could serve as a PI for a center and what the requirements are for a PI?
Thank you, Crystal. So on the requirements of a PI, we require the submitted to be a tenured faculty at the university. And the reason why we do that is an IUCRC is a pretty significant investment in time and effort. And we really want to be sure that the PI has the institutional support and the ability to execute on the IUCRC in addition to all their academic responsibilities. Now, if a PI who is untenured seeks to submit to the program, then we specifically ask that you request a waiver in advance. And the waiver typically involves a letter from the PI supervisor, so it could be typically the department chair or the dean or associate dean, and provide that in advance of the proposal submission. You should also get written approval from the Cognizant program director prior to program proposal submission, and that information needs to be included in your proposal submission so that there is evidence that you sought the waiver and you received the waiver. So if you need further details on what sorts of information we're looking for in the waiver, please write to us and we can give you a little more information.
Thank you, Prakash. Maybe a couple other questions before we go to the ones in the chat. I do just want to ask the question about, because I see it up in the chat. Behrouz, can you talk about, does each site need to submit its own preliminary proposal or full proposal? Can you talk about, are these collaborative proposals or individual proposals, and how are the individual site proposals within a proposed center reviewed?
Yes, good day, everybody. Yeah, the way we manage the IUCRCs and the sites within IUCRCs is that each site needs to submit its own preliminary as well as its own phase 1 or phase 2 proposals. These are not classified as collaborative proposals, even though we do emphasize collaboration in IUCRCs quite a bit. We like to have the flexibility to manage the sites individually, and that's because of that reason, we require that each site submit its own proposal. How are the individual site proposals within a proposed center reviewed? Yeah, so individual proposals from sites are reviewed individually with respect to how they contribute to the IUCRC and how they are basically helping IUCRC create a whole greater than sum of its parts. So it's possible that multiple sites will submit proposals for the same IUCRC, and one or more of the sites may or may not get funded during the review process. Of course, if there is a decision made not to fund that site, that the reasoning for that and the reviews will be conveyed back to the PIs so they can review and possibly consider joining the center later.
Thank you. And I realized, Behrouz, that I asked you to answer a question before I introduced you. So please allow me to introduce my colleague, Behrouz Shirazi, who's the program director for the IUCRC program within the SISE Directorate. He manages a large portfolio of centers in the computer and information sciences area. Thank you, Behrouz. And he's also going to help us keep the chat and questions going. And Behrouz, I'll give you a break for a second. Prakash, I do want to come back to you and ask you to talk about how significant a concern is an overlap with an existing center when supporting a new proposed IUCRC. So how do potential submitters think about this overlap, and what should they do to understand it and to?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you're a submitter, one of the ways to think about that question really is ask yourself the question, why should NSF invest in this proposed center, and what makes it unique? What makes it stand as a potential leader in that space? Think of your proposed center as paving some new ground, right? Exploring innovative new research ideas, areas which are currently pretty significantly underrepresented in our country, in our economy. which desperately need new knowledge creation activities to drive downstream economic activity, right? It's important for you to understand what other investments NSF has made in center-like ecosystems or in large programs, for instance, which might be in areas of your interest. We typically don't want to end up investing in similar ideas, although it might be from different programs where they're doing essentially the same kinds of things. So within the IUCRC program, we more specifically look to see if the proposed idea overlaps with an existing IUCRC center, or for that matter, an NSF-funded research center from any part of the foundation. So the first step perhaps would be to spend some time learning what existing active centers have been funded through the program and what centers have been funded in the recent past, because they may have completed their grants, and get a sense for the lay of the land as you explore pursuing certain new ideas for proposed centers.
Thank you, Prakash. And I just want to do a quick logistic mechanics question here. I think I saw Prakash, I think folks might be sending you questions directly. Would you prefer that, or do you want them to address them to the group, just to make sure we're fielding all of them?
So, Crystal, I thought that maybe you can finish your questions on this page, and then we can start the questions on the chat.
Okay, sounds great. Sounds great. Bruce, could you, given that, could you just speak to when a preliminary proposal is required? Can you just remind folks, when do they need a preliminary proposal, and how does that connect with when a full proposal is required?
Yes, so pre-proposals or preliminary proposals are required for planning awards or for asking for a waiver of a planning award. So the idea is that we would like to have a feel for what areas folks are submitting and whether or not they're prepared to submit a planning award. That's why we require these preliminary proposals. Once your planning award is granted and you go through the planning activities and you complete that, then you submit a full phase 1 proposal to set up the IUCRC. And the same thing, if you submit a preliminary proposal for a waiver and that waiver is encouraged, then you can proceed with submitting a full proposal.
Thank you. And Prakash, I'll ask you sort of these last two questions together because they really relate to industry support. Specifically, I mentioned that we require letters of industry support for a preliminary proposal for a planning grant, and we require letters of commitment for a phase 1 proposal. So if somebody's submitting a pre-proposal, what do they need? Do they need those letters in hand? And is that different between a preliminary proposal and a request for a waiver? Can you talk about that, please?
Sure. So when you submit your preliminary proposal to present a new center concept that you're interested in exploring, our expectation is that you have spent some time trying to get an initial sense for who in industry might be interested in the proposed IUCRC in the research theme that you're pursuing. So when we ask for information in the preliminary proposal, we're not really asking you to submit any letters of support, but we will take you on your word on any statement that you make that you have reached out to specific companies or organizations, discussed your idea with them, and they have expressed interest in your idea. So if you are co-submitting with, say, 2 other universities in a proposed 3-site IUCRC, the solicitation sets a minimum standard of at least 9 full members. And for the planning grant, we expect you to bring in at least 27 letters of support. So you need to present tangible evidence in the preliminary proposal. You don't need the letters, but you need to give us enough strength of evidence that you're going to get that volume of interest in your proposed idea if you were to submit the full proposal for planning. So that's what we're looking for, really strong, good, clear evidence. And we'll take you on your word. If you say you've spoken to so many organizations and they have expressed clear interest in your proposed ideas. And one of the things that we would recommend you don't do is if you're already involved talking to a bunch of companies because they're already interested in your research, you should not make the assumption that they will automatically buy into the concept of a consortial center like an IUCRC. You really need to specifically bring that up and talk to them about joining a consortium, because it's very different from investing in sponsored research with your university. So please keep that critical distinction in mind as you explore a submission of the program. The second question, if you have done extensive prior planning activities to pursue a proposed center and you're seeking the waiver, so you present evidence on all the planning activities and all the real interest in your center, the convergence on the research themes, and the strong interest from industry. For the planning grant waiver request pre-proposal, again, we don't expect you to submit any letters, but you should be in a position to state that you have received a certain number of potential letters of commitment. So you have enough real correspondence with industry where they indicate to you that, yes, if you submit a proposal, they will write you that letter of commitment, right? So that's what we're looking for. Now, having said all that, if you're encouraged for a submission for a full proposal, and you ultimately submit a full proposal, you will be required to submit those letters of financial commitment with the required language in the solicitation. So please do read the solicitation carefully for that language. You will be looking for those letters in the full proposal. Similarly, for the planning grant submission full proposal, we'll be looking for a certain critical mass of letters of support in the full proposal. So that's the critical distinction.
Great. All right. I think that's all the sort of questions we had.